He has nothing. I carried this marriage.
Then let the record speak.
You described him as financially dependent. What did you hide?
You never asked.
His father prepared this years ago.
For the divorce?
No, for the deception.
Jason Ramirez was 44, a quiet commercial building inspector in Columbus, Ohio, whose worn work boots often looked older than the buildings he inspected. Everyone around him believed he had never amounted to much, and his wife Grace made sure they kept believing it. He drove an aging Ford Explorer packed leftovers for lunch and wore the same scratched watch every day. What they didn't know was that Jason legally controlled a fortune no one had ever connected to his name. Then, inside the Franklin County Courthouse, he watched Grace smile as she told the court he was broke, while attorney Margaret Sullivan slowly laid a thick, sealed file on the table and rested her hand on its cover. If you're watching from somewhere around the world, let me know your country and your local time. In the comments, I always enjoy seeing where these stories travel. And if you enjoy slow-burning stories where patience, truth, and quiet strength eventually prevail, consider subscribing so you won't miss tomorrow's story. Jason Ramirez had never believed that a man's worth should be measured by the car parked in his driveway or the watch wrapped around his wrist. Long before anyone called him unsuccessful, he had learned to appreciate quiet routines, steady work, and promises that lasted longer than applause. Every weekday morning began the same way. At 5:45 a.m., before most of Columbus had turned on its first kitchen light, Jason would wake without an alarm brew a single cup of black coffee, iron his work shirt, and leave the small brick house in Clintonville just after sunrise. The house itself looked ordinary. 2 stories, white shutters, a maple tree that dropped leaves across the front lawn every October. Nothing about it suggested wealth. Nothing invited curiosity. The neighbors assumed Jason had purchased it decades ago because it was affordable. In reality, they knew almost nothing about him beyond the fact that he waved politely while mowing the lawn every Saturday. His aging Ford Explorer always occupied the same spot in the driveway. The faded silver paint had begun peeling around the rear bumper, and the driver's seat carried a crack in the leather that Jason had repaired himself with a simple stitching kit instead of replacing it. He saw no reason to buy another vehicle, while this one still started every morning. Grace saw it differently. Whenever she climbed into the passenger seat, she looked around with visible disappointment. She compared Jason's SUV to the luxury crossovers driven by her coworkers and friends, often sighing before fastening her seatbelt. "You know," she once said, while adjusting the mirror, "people notice these things." Jason kept his eyes on the road. They notice whether you treat them well more than what you drive. Grace gave a short laugh. "I wish the real world worked like that." Jason never answered. Silence had become his preferred response whenever conversations drifted toward appearances. When they first met 12 years earlier, Grace had admired that quality. She was working as a marketing coordinator for a regional healthcare company in downtown Columbus. Jason had stopped by the office to inspect renovations after a fire safety upgrade. Their first conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Grace noticed his calm confidence. Jason noticed how easily she made everyone around her smile. They met again 2 weeks later at a neighborhood coffee shop on High Street. Then again, and again. Grace often told friends that Jason made her feel safe. Not excited, not overwhelmed. Safe. He listened more than he spoke. He never interrupted. He remembered small details that others forgot. If Grace mentioned she had a stressful presentation coming up, flowers quietly appeared on her doorstep the evening before. If she complained about a noisy ceiling fan, Jason fixed it without making her feel incapable. His kindness was practical, reliable, uncomplicated. It was the kind of love that built itself slowly instead of announcing its arrival. Their wedding took place on a warm Saturday in late May at Franklin Park Conservatory. Fewer than 80 guests attended. Jason insisted on keeping the ceremony small, and Grace agreed without hesitation. At least she did then. During the first few years of marriage, very little changed. Jason continued working for the city. Grace gradually climbed the corporate ladder. They cooked dinner together most evenings. Sunday mornings belonged to farmers' markets and long walks through Goodale Park. Friends often described them as balanced. Jason was quiet. Grace was outgoing. Jason preferred practical purchases. Grace enjoyed celebrating milestones. The differences seemed healthy, until they slowly became expectations. Grace's promotion to senior marketing manager brought higher income, larger bonuses, and a completely different social circle. More of her evenings were spent attending networking dinners, fundraising galas, and company receptions held in upscale hotels around Columbus. Jason attended when invited. He wore the same tailored navy suit he had owned for years. Grace bought a new dress almost every season. The contrast rarely escaped notice. One evening, after returning from a company banquet at the Westin Great Southern Columbus, Grace stood in front of the bedroom mirror, removing her earrings. "You know what Melissa asked me tonight?" Jason loosened his tie. "What?" "She wanted to know why someone as successful as me married someone who still drives that old Explorer." Jason folded his jacket carefully over the chair. "And what did you tell her?" Grace hesitated only briefly. "I laughed." Jason looked toward her reflection. "And then, I told her you're happy living simply." "That's true." "I also told her you aren't exactly ambitious." The room became quiet. Jason finished hanging his shirt before speaking. "I've never wanted to compete with anyone." Grace crossed her arms. "Maybe that's the problem." He could have defended himself. He could have explained that ambition came in many forms. He could have mentioned the dozens of public buildings he helped keep safe every year. Instead, he simply turned off the bedroom light. The next morning, life continued as usual. That was Jason's way. He believed most arguments became smaller if they weren't fed. Grace believed silence meant surrender. Over the following years, her priorities shifted so gradually that even she might not have noticed the exact moment everything changed. The conversations became increasingly focused on comparison. Brian Whitaker, Grace's older brother, had recently purchased a lake house outside Cincinnati. Melissa Parker had posted photos from another European vacation. A coworker had upgraded to a new Mercedes. Someone else's husband had become a partner at a law firm before turning 40. Each story ended with the same unspoken question. Why not Jason? Jason listened patiently whenever Grace described someone else's success. Sometimes he nodded. Sometimes he smiled. Occasionally he asked whether those people were actually happy. Grace always rolled her eyes. "Happiness doesn't pay for retirement." Jason quietly replied, "Neither does pretending." The comment lingered in the room long after dinner ended. Still, he never explained why expensive things held so little appeal for him. He never mentioned his father's lessons. He never mentioned the trust. He never mentioned the law firm that still mailed confidential statements to a private office downtown instead of their home. Those belonged to another part of his life, a part he believed did not define who he was. His father had spent years reminding him that wealth attracted opinions before it attracted friendships. Jason had listened carefully. Perhaps too carefully. Grace interpreted his modest lifestyle as lack of ambition because he allowed her to. He never corrected assumptions unless facts actually required correction. Outside the marriage, the misunderstandings multiplied. At neighborhood barbecues, people casually assumed Grace earned far more than Jason. At holiday dinners, relatives asked Jason whether he planned to move into management someday. He answered politely, "No, I enjoy the work I do." Most people smiled politely before changing the subject. Grace usually added something that made everyone laugh. "Jason's happy exactly where he is." Sometimes she squeezed his shoulder while saying it. Other times she laughed before anyone else could. The jokes became more frequent. Then they became stories. Stories became assumptions. Assumptions slowly became Jason's public identity. One Friday evening, Grace hosted several co-workers for dinner. Melissa Parker admired the renovated kitchen before joking that Grace must have paid for all of it herself. Grace laughed while pouring wine. "I won't say I paid for everything." She paused just long enough for everyone to look toward Jason. "But let's just say I wasn't counting on my husband to finance my dream kitchen." Laughter circled the dining room. Jason smiled politely. He continued slicing the roast without correcting anyone. Melissa looked at him with something close to sympathy. "You've got yourself a patient wife." Jason simply nodded. Inside, disappointment settled quietly, not because of the joke itself, but because Grace had stopped noticing the difference between playful teasing and public disrespect. As the guests prepared to leave later that night, Melissa hugged Grace near the front door. Jason was carrying empty glasses back toward the kitchen when he heard Grace's voice drifting through the hallway. "I'm serious," Grace whispered with another laugh. "Jason's basically broke." The words were soft, but Jason heard every one of them. He paused only for a second before continuing toward the sink, setting the glasses down one by one without making a sound. Margaret Sullivan never wasted words. Jason recognized that before she finished her first sentence. "Can you come by the office this afternoon?" He looked through the windshield toward the frozen surface of the Scioto River. "Is something wrong?" There was a brief pause. "I'd rather explain it face to face." "You sound concerned." "I am." Jason checked the dashboard clock. "I have inspections until 3. "I'll wait." Margaret ended the call without another unnecessary sentence. Jason slipped the cream-colored envelope back into his jacket pocket before starting the Explorer. His morning schedule remained unchanged. Lincoln Community Center, a public library renovation, a fire suppression inspection at a municipal warehouse. He completed each assignment with the same concentration as always. No one around him noticed anything different. Kevin Morris did notice one small detail. Jason skipped lunch. "You okay?" Kevin asked while reviewing inspection photos. "I'm fine." "You've looked distracted." Jason smiled faintly. "I've just got an appointment later." Kevin nodded. "Hope everything's all right." "So do I." At exactly 3:45, Jason parked outside Sullivan and Pierce Attorneys at Law on East Broad Street. The building had changed very little over the past 20 years. Dark limestone exterior, brass directory beside the entrance, mahogany reception desk. Even the grandfather clock in the lobby remained exactly where Daniel Ramirez had admired it decades earlier. Margaret Sullivan greeted Jason personally instead of asking her assistant to escort him. She was 66 now. Her silver hair rested neatly above a navy blazer, and thin reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck. She smiled warmly. "You look more like your father every year." Jason returned the smile. "I hear that often." She let him into her private office before closing the door. No small talk followed. That alone told Jason the meeting mattered. Margaret opened a locked cabinet beside her desk and removed a gray archival box. The label read only one word: Ramirez. She placed the box carefully between them. "You remember your father's instructions after the funeral?" Jason nodded. "He said there were documents that should remain sealed unless certain conditions developed." Margaret folded her hands. "They have." Jason remained silent. Margaret appreciated that quality about him. Unlike many clients, he never rushed toward conclusions. She slid a typed document across the desk. "Your father wrote this 12 years ago." Jason immediately recognized Daniel Ramirez's signature. The first paragraph read almost like a personal letter. "Jason, if Margaret has shown you this document, then events have unfolded exactly as I feared they might. I hope I was wrong. If I wasn't, you must continue doing what we've discussed for years. Do not answer accusations with anger. Let documented facts speak after every assumption has exhausted itself." Jason looked up. Margaret watched him carefully. "I've reread that letter many times." "He expected this," Margaret answered honestly. He believed it was possible. Jason leaned back slowly. My father barely knew Grace. He knew people. That answer required no explanation. Daniel Ramirez had spent 40 years practicing corporate and estate law. He trusted documentation because he had watched memories change inside courtrooms. He trusted patience because he had watched emotional people destroy otherwise strong cases. Margaret opened the archival box. Inside rested dozens of sealed folders. Every tab carried a date. Every envelope remained unopened. Jason frowned. I've never seen these. You weren't supposed to. Margaret selected one folder marked Private Trust Instructions. Another carried the title Asset Ownership Structure. Another read Marital Contingency. Jason stared at the final label. What exactly is marital contingency? Margaret did not answer immediately. Instead, she opened a thick leather notebook containing handwritten instructions from Daniel Ramirez himself. Your father believed wealth should protect family. She turned another page. But if family became the reason protection was needed... She stopped reading. Then the same structure should protect you. Jason listened without interruption. Margaret continued. Everything your father transferred before his death was placed inside the Ramirez Family Preservation Trust. Jason knew that much already. The trust owned commercial real estate across Ohio, warehouse properties, medical office buildings, several industrial leases, minority interests in regional logistics companies. What surprised most people was that Jason controlled almost none of those assets directly. The trust did. His personal tax returns reflected only his city salary plus modest annual trust distributions. Anyone performing an ordinary financial search would conclude Jason lived exactly as he appeared. Middle class, comfortable, unremarkable, entirely ordinary. That arrangement had never bothered him. He preferred it. Margaret continued reading. The trust agreement contains a review clause. Jason looked up. A review of what? Marital conduct. His expression barely changed. Margaret appreciated that too. Many clients panicked before hearing complete explanations. Jason waited. The clause does not punish disagreement. It reviews evidence of financial manipulation, intentional misrepresentation, concealment, or attempts to benefit from false financial narratives. Jason spoke quietly. My father expected someone might lie about me. Margaret met his eyes. He expected someone might mistake silence for weakness. The room became very still. Margaret opened another folder. Inside rested copies of annual trust reports, property valuations, corporate ownership charts, lease summaries, investment performance statements. Jason had signed most of them over the years without studying every attachment. His father and Margaret had always managed administration. Current estimated value. Margaret slid one page toward him. Jason glanced down. He saw the number. Just over $83 million. The figure no longer shocked him. It represented buildings, businesses, and decades of disciplined investing rather than cash sitting inside a bank account. To him, they were responsibilities. To strangers, they would look like unimaginable wealth. Margaret folded the valuation report closed again. No one outside the trustees has legal access to these records. Jason nodded. I know. She studied him for a moment. Does Grace? No? Has she ever asked? Once. And I told her my father left investments that I preferred keeping private. Margaret sighed softly. Did she accept that? At the time? Margaret slowly removed another envelope. This one looked newer. Its seal had been broken only recently. I need you to understand why I called today. She opened the envelope. Inside rested several printed screenshots, social media posts, public comments, photographs. Jason recognized Grace immediately. Melissa Parker appeared beside her in nearly every picture. The captions looked harmless at first. Girls' weekend. Hard work pays off. building the future. Then the comments began. Someone joked that Grace deserved a husband who earned executive money. Another person replied that she must be supporting him. Grace had answered with a laughing emoji. Then another comment. Pretty much. Jason quietly turned another page. Melissa had written, "Grace practically carries the whole household." Grace responded, "Someone has to." Jason stared at the page. His breathing remained steady. Margaret watched his face carefully. No anger, no visible embarrassment, only disappointment. "How long have you had these?" Margaret answered truthfully. 3 weeks. "Who sent them?" "A private investigator." Jason looked surprised. "I didn't hire one." "No." Margaret closed the folder. "Your father did." Jason looked confused. 12 years ago? Margaret nodded. He established a dormant monitoring agreement with Hawthorne Risk Consulting. Jason blinked. "They've been watching Grace for 12 years. "Not constantly," Margaret clarified immediately. "They were instructed to remain inactive unless one of 3 legal triggers appeared." Jason waited. One of those triggers involved repeated public misrepresentation connected to marital finances. And that happened. Margaret gently tapped the stack of printed pages. "They believe it has." Jason leaned back into the leather chair. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "What happens now?" Margaret folded Daniel Ramirez's handwritten instructions closed before answering. "Now we find out whether your father's final contingency plan was unnecessary." She paused. "Or the most important document he ever wrote." Jason left Margaret Sullivan's office carrying nothing except the cream-colored envelope and a legal pad containing 3 handwritten notes. "Do nothing emotional. Document everything. Wait." The simplicity of the instructions almost seemed disappointing. No dramatic confrontation, no hidden recording devices, no immediate divorce filing, no attempt to expose Grace before friends or family. Margaret had been remarkably clear. "If your father spent 12 years preparing for this possibility," she had said while walking him to the elevator, "don't destroy his work by reacting in 12 minutes. Jason understood. His father had never believed patience meant weakness. Patience simply prevented mistakes. As he drove home through downtown Columbus, snow drifted across the windshield in slow waves. Traffic crawled. The city looked ordinary. Coffee shops remained busy. People hurried toward parking garages. Nothing in the outside world reflected the shift that had quietly taken place inside his own. For the first time, Jason knew there might already be a legal path unfolding beneath the surface of his marriage. He simply did not know where it ended. Grace arrived home nearly an hour after him. She entered carrying 2 expensive shopping bags. Melissa found a clearance sale. Jason looked up from the dining table where he had been reviewing building inspection reports. "Looks like you found more than one thing." She smiled. "Everything was half off." Jason nodded. "That's good." Grace disappeared upstairs before coming back in different clothes. She noticed dinner already warming in the oven. "You cooked," Jason shrugged. "I got home first." She kissed his cheek almost automatically. "You're sweet." The gesture felt familiar, comfortable, routine. Jason wondered how many routines could survive when built upon inaccurate assumptions. During dinner, Grace talked almost entirely about work. A regional vice president from Cincinnati had visited. 2 managers were competing for the next promotion. Someone else had accepted a position in Chicago. Jason listened. He asked questions. He smiled at appropriate moments. Nothing appeared unusual. Late that evening, Grace went upstairs to answer a phone call. Jason remained in this kitchen loading the dishwasher. Her voice drifted faintly through the hallway. He still doesn't know. Jason stopped moving for only a moment. The dishwasher door remained open. "No. He never asks." A brief laugh followed. "Exactly." The floor above creaked softly as Grace paced across the bedroom. Jason could no longer hear individual words. He quietly finished placing the last plate inside the dishwasher before turning it on. He made no attempt to listen at the staircase. His father had once said that overheard fragments often created false conclusions. Complete evidence mattered, not incomplete conversations. The next morning, Margaret called before Jason left for work. "I have something for you." "What is it?" "A copy of the monitoring agreement." Jason remained silent. She continued, "You deserve to understand how your father structured it." That evening, he returned to Sullivan and Pierce. Margaret handed him a bound copy of the agreement Daniel Ramirez had signed 12 years earlier with Hawthorne Risk Consulting. Jason expected something invasive. Instead, he found an extremely limited arrangement. No surveillance, no private tracking, no monitoring of daily life. The investigators remained completely inactive unless specific legal thresholds appeared. Public financial misrepresentations, attempts to gain access to protected trust assets, evidence suggesting fraudulent financial narratives affecting marital property. Only then could the firm begin documenting publicly available information. Margaret pointed toward one paragraph. "Your father insisted on strict boundaries." Jason read carefully. The investigators could only collect lawful evidence, public statements, public records, social media, witness interviews conducted voluntarily, no wiretaps, no trespassing, no hidden cameras inside private homes. Daniel Ramirez had protected ethics as carefully as he protected assets. Jason appreciated that. "My father expected fairness." Margaret smiled. "He believed truth survives without cheating." She handed him another folder. "This contains everything Hawthorne has collected so far." Jason opened it slowly. Most pages consisted of screenshots, Grace posing beside co-workers, professional networking events, fundraisers, charity dinners. Most looked perfectly ordinary. Then certain captions began repeating. "Independent woman, self-made, supporting dead weight, carrying the family, building my own future." Many of those comments came from other people. Grace rarely initiated them, but she almost never corrected them either. Sometimes she encouraged them with a laughing response. Sometimes she replied with short phrases. "You said it, not me. Someone has to. It's complicated." Jason kept reading. Several posts came from Melissa Parker. One photo showed Grace standing beside a luxury SUV. Melissa had written, "Finally bought herself something nice without waiting for anyone else." Grace replied, "Best decision I've made in years." Jason frowned. He recognized the SUV immediately. It wasn't Grace's. It belonged to her company during a leadership retreat. The picture intentionally created another impression. Again, Jason felt no anger, only disappointment. Margaret observed him carefully. "You still haven't asked the obvious question." Jason looked up. "What question?" "Why would someone create this image?" Jason considered the folder for several seconds. "I don't know." Margaret nodded. "Good." He looked surprised. "You don't want me guessing. I want you observing." Jason almost smiled. She sounded exactly like his father. Margaret leaned forward. "Assumptions make poor evidence." "What do we actually know?" She answered methodically. "We know Grace repeatedly allows people to believe you're financially dependent." She turned another page. "We know those statements are objectively false." Another page. "We know she's presented herself publicly as carrying the marriage financially." Another page. "We know those representations have become increasingly frequent." Jason nodded. "Everything else remains unknown." "Correct." As Jason prepared to leave, Margaret stopped him. "One more thing." She opened the final folder inside the box. This one contained no social media screenshots, only one sealed envelope. Across the front appeared Daniel Ramirez's handwriting, "For Jason only. When the time is right." Margaret did not hand it over. Instead, she returned it to the box. Jason looked confused. I thought this was the time. It isn't. When will it be? Margaret closed the lid. When the first legal move is made. What legal move? I don't know. Jason frowned. My father didn't specify. He wrote something else. Margaret removed a single sheet from her notebook. Daniel's handwriting remained as neat as ever. If Jason comes asking for the final envelope too early, tell him no. If circumstances have truly reached the point, I fear someone else will make the first move. Jason never has to. His strength has always been restraint. Jason slowly exhaled. Even after death, his father seemed to anticipate his questions. Driving home, Jason replayed the sentence repeatedly. Someone else will make the first move. What did that mean? Grace certainly wasn't discussing divorce. She behaved as though everything remained completely normal. 3 days later, Jason found another answer. He returned home early because a scheduled inspection had been postponed. Grace's car was already in the driveway. So was Melissa Parker's. Their voices drifted from the living room before Jason even entered the house. He'll never see it coming. Jason quietly closed the front door. It's practically guaranteed. Melissa laughed. I told you, Grace answered confidently. He signs anything if it's organized enough. Jason remained perfectly still. The narrator understood something neither woman realized. Jason Ramirez had signed thousands of legal documents throughout his life, but he never signed a single page before reading every line. His father had trained him differently. The living room suddenly fell silent. Someone had heard the front door. Grace walked into the hallway, smiling. You're home early. Jason returned the smile with effortless calm. Inspection got canceled. Melissa appeared behind her carrying 2 coffee mugs. Perfect timing. Grace looked at Jason. Actually, she hesitated just long enough to sound casual. There's something I'd like you to sign later tonight. Jason smiled exactly as he always did. Of course. Inside, however, one sentence from Daniel Ramirez echoed louder than ever. Someone else will make the first move. Jason had a feeling that moment had finally arrived. Jason did not answer Grace immediately. Instead, he removed his coat, hung it neatly beside the front door, and greeted Melissa Parker with the same calm politeness he had shown every time she visited their home. Good evening, Melissa. She smiled with practiced confidence. Hi, Jason. He noticed the leather portfolio lying on the coffee table. Dark brown. Expensive. Brand new. Beside it sat 2 ceramic coffee mugs and a silver pen. Someone had clearly prepared the room before he arrived. Grace motioned toward the sofa. Sit down. It'll only take a minute. Jason sat. His expression remained relaxed. Grace opened the portfolio and removed a stack of documents clipped together with yellow tabs, marking several signature lines. I've been talking with our financial advisor. Jason looked at the cover page. There was no advisor's logo, no law firm's letterhead, only a generic title, Household Financial Consolidation Agreement. He looked up. I don't remember us hiring a financial advisor, Grace answered smoothly. It's just someone Melissa knows. Melissa nodded. He helps couples simplify ownership structures. Jason smiled politely. What firm? Melissa hesitated. He's independent. Jason noticed the pause. So did the narrator. It was the first time Melissa had sounded uncertain. Grace quickly stepped in. Jason, it's nothing complicated. She pointed toward the first highlighted section. It just lets me manage our household finances more efficiently. Jason picked up the first page. He began reading. Not scanning. Reading, line by line, word by word. Grace shifted slightly on the sofa. Melissa glanced toward the kitchen clock. 5 minutes passed. No one spoke. Jason reached page 3, then page 4. Grace finally laughed softly. You really do read everything. Jason looked up. My father taught me to. He returned to the document. Near the middle of page 6, one sentence caught his attention. The agreement authorized Grace to negotiate financial matters on behalf of both spouses regarding jointly represented assets. Jason continued reading. Page 7. The wording changed. Any assets voluntarily disclosed after execution of this agreement could be evaluated for household restructuring. He turned another page. Household restructuring. An unusually vague phrase. Page 9 contained another paragraph. Either spouse acknowledged reliance upon representations made by the other regarding financial status. Jason quietly reread that sentence. Representations, financial status. He looked at Grace. What exactly is this for? Grace smiled. It protects us. From what, if something happened? What kind of something? Melissa answered instead. Life. Jason looked directly at her. I asked my wife. Melissa leaned back without replying. Grace folded her hands. You know I've been handling most of our financial planning. Jason nodded. You've handled budgeting. And investments. You've invested your retirement account. And I think we should simplify everything. Jason continued reading. He eventually reached the final page. No attorney had prepared it. No notary block appeared. No witness section. Only 2 signature lines. One for Grace, one for Jason. Neither had been signed. Jason closed the packet. When do you need this? Grace smiled with obvious relief. Tonight would be great. Jason rested both hands on the document. I'd like Margaret Sullivan to review it. Silence. Not awkward silence. Dangerous silence. Melissa spoke first. Why would you involve a lawyer? Jason answered without emotion. Because this is a legal document. Grace laughed. Jason, Margaret handles your father's trust. Correct. This has nothing to do with that. I know. Then why complicate it? Jason's answer came naturally. My father had one rule. Grace looked impatient. What rule? Never sign a legal document without legal review. Melissa forced a smile. That's a little old-fashioned. Jason nodded. So is reading contracts before signing them. Grace's shoulders stiffened, almost imperceptibly. The narrator noticed. Jason did not pretend otherwise. He simply observed. Grace reached for the papers. If you trust me, you shouldn't need another lawyer. Jason met her eyes calmly. I do trust legal review. The sentence landed harder than he intended. Grace withdrew her hand. No one's trying to trick you. I didn't say anyone was. Melissa crossed one leg over the other. It honestly feels like you're making this bigger than it is. Jason stood. I probably am. He smiled pleasantly. Which is exactly why Margaret should look at it. He handed the papers back to Grace. If everything is as simple as you say, she'll probably approve it tomorrow. Grace did not answer. Melissa gathered her purse. I should get going. The conversation ended several minutes later. Jason watched Melissa drive away through the front window. Grace remained unusually quiet while loading the dishwasher. Normally she filled silence with conversation. Tonight she barely spoke. Around 10 o'clock, she finally broke the silence. Do you think I would ever take advantage of you? Jason closed the novel he had been reading. I've never thought about it. That's not an answer. It is. She folded her arms. You don't trust me. Jason looked at her gently. I don't sign legal documents without review. You trusted me when we got married. I trusted vows. She stared at him. You've changed. Jason almost smiled. No. He thought silently. I've simply started paying attention. The following morning, Jason arrived at Margaret's office before work. She accepted the document without surprise. I was expecting this. Jason raised an eyebrow. You were... Margaret pointed toward the title page. "I've seen versions of this agreement before." Jason's expression remained calm. "Whoa. How many?" "7. Exactly like this." "Almost." Margaret adjusted her glasses. "They usually appear before someone files for divorce." Jason remained completely still. She continued. "The wording is intentionally broad." "What does it actually do?" Margaret opened the document. "It encourages voluntary disclosure." Jason nodded. "I saw that." "Once disclosed," she tapped another paragraph, "assets become easier to argue as marital considerations." Jason understood immediately. "So if I voluntarily listed trust assets," Margaret finished the sentence, "someone could later argue they were relevant to financial negotiations." Jason looked towards the window. "Would they win?" "No," she answered confidently. "But litigation becomes far more expensive." Jason slowly nodded. "So the document isn't illegal?" "No. It's strategic. Very." Margaret closed the folder. "I'll prepare a written opinion." Jason thanked her and stood to leave. Before he reached the door, Margaret spoke again. "Hawthorne called this morning." Jason turned. "They found something new." She handed him another folder. Inside rested public records from Franklin County. Business registrations, event schedules. One page had been highlighted. Grace Reynolds Ramirez, guest speaker, Women's Financial Independence Summit, Columbus Convention Center, Saturday. Jason looked confused. "She's giving a speech." Margaret nodded. "Apparently." He turned another page. The event description listed several discussion topics: building wealth independently, taking control of household finances, creating financial freedom regardless of your partner's income. Jason felt the first genuine weight settle inside his chest. Grace had never mentioned speaking publicly. Margaret quietly added another sheet. It contained promotional material. One sentence had been highlighted in yellow. "Hear how Grace Ramirez became the primary financial provider in her marriage while creating her own success story." Jason stared at the page for several long seconds. Every statement rested upon the same false foundation. Margaret folded her hands. "She's no longer repeating these claims casually." Jason looked up. "She's building a public reputation around them." "Exactly," he spoke quietly. "And public reputations can become evidence." Margaret nodded once. "They already have." Jason left the office without another word. Driving toward work, he passed the Columbus Convention Center. Workers were unloading equipment for the upcoming weekend conference. Large promotional banners already hung outside the building. He slowed briefly at a traffic light. One enormous banner displayed photographs of 5 keynote speakers. Grace stood in the center, smiling, confident. Below her picture appeared a single sentence: "Transforming financial struggle into personal success." Jason watched the traffic light turn green. Then he drove away without stopping. He still had no intention of confronting her. But for the first time, he understood that Grace's story was becoming larger than their marriage. She was asking strangers to believe a version of Jason Ramirez that had never existed. And somewhere behind Daniel Ramirez's carefully prepared legal files, another clock had quietly begun counting down. Saturday morning arrived beneath a pale gray Ohio sky. The Columbus Convention Center parking garage filled before 8 o'clock. Luxury sedans lined the upper levels. Corporate sponsors unloaded banners and promotional displays. Volunteers hurried between registration tables carrying clipboards and boxes of welcome packets. Jason parked 2 blocks away, not because he wanted to avoid attention, because he had no intention of attending the conference as Grace's husband. He wore dark jeans, a navy sweater, and a charcoal overcoat. Ordinary clothes. Exactly the kind no one remembered afterward. Margaret Sullivan had advised him only one thing before he left: observe. Don't participate. Jason intended to do exactly that. Inside the convention center, the lobby buzzed with confident conversations. Entrepreneurs, small business owners, financial coaches, corporate managers. Most attendees carried notebooks bearing motivational slogans about independence and wealth. Large digital screens displayed the conference schedule. The second keynote session attracted the largest audience. Grace Ramirez, Transforming Financial Struggle into Personal Success. Jason stopped in front of the display for only a moment. Several women nearby admired Grace's promotional photograph. "I've followed her online. I heard she's incredible. Didn't she build everything herself?" Jason continued walking without changing expression. The narrator noticed something unusual. Not one statement came from Grace directly. Instead, hundreds of strangers had already accepted a carefully constructed reputation. That reputation now possessed momentum of its own. Inside Ballroom C, nearly 400 chairs faced a brightly lit stage. Jason selected a seat in the last row beside a support column. From there, he could see everything while remaining almost invisible. Grace appeared backstage 15 minutes later. She wore a cream-colored designer suit Jason had never seen before. Professional makeup, diamond earrings, confident posture. She looked every bit like someone who belonged in front of a business audience. Jason watched quietly. There was no anger, only curiosity. The master of ceremonies introduced her enthusiastically. "Our next speaker has inspired thousands of women by proving that financial independence isn't limited by difficult circumstances." Applause filled the room. Grace stepped onto the stage, smiling. She thanked the audience before beginning. "My story isn't about money." She paused confidently. "It's about refusing to let someone else's limitations define your future." More applause. Jason remained perfectly still. Grace continued. "When I got married, I believed hard work alone would build our future." She smiled gently. "But life doesn't always match expectations." Several audience members nodded sympathetically. "I discovered that sometimes the person you love has no ambition." Jason lowered his eyes briefly. Not because the words hurt, because they sounded rehearsed. Grace walked slowly across the stage. "I don't say this to criticize anyone." A few people laughed knowingly. "I say it because many women here have probably experienced something similar." More nodding, more agreement. Jason quietly opened the notebook he had brought. Not to record emotions, to record exact statements, sentence after sentence, word after word. Grace never mentioned Jason by name. She didn't need to. Everyone understood. "When I realized I would become the primary provider," Jason wrote the sentence exactly as spoken. "I stopped waiting for someone else to change." Another sentence. "I built stability with my own discipline." Another. "I learned that appearances can fool people." Another. "Sometimes the strongest financial decision is accepting that your partner may never become the person you hoped." The audience applauded again. Jason looked around the ballroom. Many people appeared genuinely inspired. That disturbed him more than the speech itself. They believed they were hearing truth. Not exaggeration, not selective storytelling. Truth. Near the front row sat a photographer capturing every important moment. Each flash documented another public statement, another permanent record, another piece of evidence. Jason continued writing. He noticed Grace becoming increasingly comfortable. The more applause she received, the bolder her language became. "My husband is a good man." She smiled sympathetically. "But goodness doesn't pay mortgages." Soft laughter echoed through the ballroom. Jason calmly wrote every word. "My career succeeded because I accepted reality instead of excuses." Applause. "I stopped apologizing for earning more." Applause again. "I stopped pretending our marriage was financially equal." Even louder applause. Jason underlined that final sentence. His father's trust records demonstrated precisely the opposite. Grace had crossed beyond implication. She had made factual claims, publicly, repeatedly. After 45 minutes, the keynote ended with a standing ovation. Grace smiled, thanked everyone, and stepped off the stage. Jason remained seated until most attendees moved toward the networking reception. Only then did he quietly leave the ballroom. He never approached Grace, never attempted a confrontation. Instead, he crossed the lobby and entered a small cafe inside the convention center. Margaret had arranged to meet him there. She arrived carrying a slim leather briefcase. "Well," Jason handed her the notebook. "I wrote everything." She scanned several pages. Then she nodded slowly. "Better than a recording." Jason looked surprised. "I thought recordings would be stronger." Margaret shook her head. "Not always." She tapped the notebook. "Your contemporaneous written notes establish a timeline." She closed the notebook carefully. "And there were nearly 400 witnesses." Jason stirred his untouched coffee. "I kept waiting for her to stop." Margaret looked at him. Instead, she became more confident. Jason nodded. "Exactly." Margaret smiled faintly. "Confidence often appears right before overreach." She removed another folder from her briefcase. "Hawthorne investigators attended too." Jason raised an eyebrow. "They did?" "3 of them. They recorded the entire keynote." Jason leaned back quietly. "So now we have witnesses." She counted on her fingers. "Professional video. Printed conference materials. Promotional advertisements. Your written observations. And the event photographer." Jason absorbed the list. Margaret folded the folder closed. "The evidence keeps building itself." Jason looked through the cafe window toward the convention center entrance. Grace stood outside, surrounded by attendees asking for photographs. She laughed comfortably. Accepted compliments, signed conference programs. Someone handed her flowers. Another asked for a business card. Jason watched silently. The version of Grace standing outside looked unfamiliar. Not because she dressed differently, because she appeared completely convinced by the story she had created. Margaret followed his gaze. "Do you still love her?" Jason answered honestly. "I love the woman I thought I married." Margaret nodded. "That's an important distinction." Before leaving, she handed him a business card. "Hawthorne wants you to meet someone." "Who?" "A forensic accountant." Jason frowned. "I don't have hidden accounts. This isn't about yours." Margaret stood. "It's about hers." Jason looked up sharply. "What did they find?" "They don't know yet." She paused. "But they're asking the right questions." Monday morning, Jason arrived at work to discover his supervisor waiting outside his office. "Jason?" "Morning, Carl?" Carl Benson closed the door behind them. "I received an unusual phone call Friday." Jason listened. "A woman wanted to verify your employment." Jason frowned. "What woman?" "She wouldn't identify herself." "What did she ask?" Carl opened a notepad. "Whether you were full-time. Whether you owned company shares. Whether your salary had recently changed." Jason remained expressionless. "What did you tell her?" Carl smiled. "Nothing." Jason relaxed slightly. "I figured employment information wasn't anyone's business." "It isn't." Carl leaned against the desk. "Everything okay?" Jason considered the question. "Not yet." Carl studied him for several seconds. "If you need anything, let me know." After Carl left, Jason closed his office door. Someone had started asking questions. Not about the trust, not about Daniel's estate, about Jason's employment. Exactly the kind of information required before preparing financial paperwork. His father's final letter echoed once again inside his memory. "Someone else will make the first move." Jason slowly opened his desk drawer. Inside rested Margaret's written legal opinion regarding the document Grace wanted him to sign. On the last page, one sentence had been typed in bold. If additional requests for financial disclosure or employment verification occur, preserve every communication immediately. Such activity frequently precedes formal legal filings. Jason folded the opinion back into its envelope. Then his office phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar Columbus law office. He answered calmly. "This is Jason Ramirez." A professional female voice spoke on the other end. "Mr. Ramirez, my name is Rebecca Collins. I'm calling on behalf of Ashford Family Law. We'd like to schedule a meeting regarding a matter involving your wife, Grace Ramirez." Jason closed his eyes for one brief second. His father had been right. The first legal move had finally been made. Jason accepted the meeting for Wednesday afternoon. He neither argued nor asked unnecessary questions. Rebecca Collins simply provided an address. Ashford Family Law occupied the top floor of a modern office building overlooking the Scioto River. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. After hanging up, Jason immediately called Margaret Sullivan. "I received the call." "I expected you would." "They want a meeting," Margaret answered without hesitation. "You won't attend alone." Wednesday arrived with cold rain sweeping across downtown Columbus. Jason parked beneath the building and waited inside his truck until Margaret's sedan pulled into the adjacent space. She climbed out carrying 2 organized legal binders. "You look rested," she said. Jason smiled faintly. "I slept." "Good." "They probably didn't." Margaret's confidence wasn't arrogance. It came from preparation. Inside the elevator, she reviewed only one instruction. "Answer only what you're asked." Jason nodded. "If they ask about the trust, you don't volunteer anything." "If they ask directly, you answer truthfully." She looked directly at him. "But only the question they actually ask." The receptionist greeted them professionally before escorting them into a large conference room. Ashford Family Law clearly specialized in high-net-worth divorces. Awards lined the hallway. Framed magazine articles decorated the walls. Everything projected success. Rebecca Collins entered first. Early 40s, sharp gray suit, measured smile. Professional, without appearing hostile. She extended her hand. "Mr. Ramirez." Jason shook it calmly. "Miss Collins." Margaret introduced herself. Rebecca recognized the name immediately. "I've heard excellent things." Margaret smiled politely. "I appreciate that." Several minutes later, Grace entered. She wore another tailored business suit, confident, relaxed, as though she expected a routine meeting. She glanced briefly toward Margaret. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. "So you brought a lawyer?" Jason answered evenly. "You did." Rebecca cleared her throat. "Shall we begin?" Everyone sat. Rebecca opened a legal folder. "My client intends to dissolve the marriage." Grace folded her hands calmly. Jason remained silent. Rebecca continued. "We hope to accomplish this respectfully." Margaret nodded. "So do we." Rebecca slid several pages across the table. "This represents our preliminary settlement proposal." Jason made no attempt to touch it. Margaret picked it up first. She read quietly, every page, every paragraph. Grace watched Jason instead, perhaps expecting disappointment, perhaps anger. She found neither. Jason simply sat with his hands folded together. Rebecca finally spoke again. "Mr. Ramirez." "Yes." "My client believes an uncontested divorce would benefit everyone," Jason answered softly. "I imagine she does." Grace looked irritated by his calmness. Rebecca continued. "The proposal reflects the financial realities of the marriage." Margaret stopped reading. "Interesting choice of words." Rebecca smiled professionally. "Our understanding is that Mrs. Ramirez served as the primary financial contributor." Silence settled over the conference room. Jason looked toward Margaret. She looked back. Neither interrupted. Rebecca interpreted their silence as uncertainty. She continued confidently. Given Mr. Ramirez's comparatively modest earnings, Margaret raised one finger. "Excuse me." Rebecca stopped. "Could you identify the documents supporting that conclusion?" Rebecca appeared prepared. She removed several printed exhibits: tax returns, payroll summaries, conference biographies, Grace's speaking profile, bank statements from Grace's personal accounts. Margaret examined each document. Then she organized them into neat piles. No trust documents. Rebecca frowned slightly. "I'm sorry. No estate documents. No inheritance records. No ownership schedules." Rebecca answered carefully. "We're discussing marital assets." Margaret nodded. "Exactly." Grace shifted in her chair. For the first time that afternoon, she seemed uncomfortable. Rebecca continued. "Our information indicates Mr. Ramirez earns approximately $94,000 annually," Jason answered calmly. "That's correct." Rebecca looked satisfied. "And Mrs. Ramirez's consulting business generated approximately $280,000 last year." Grace nodded confidently. "Correct." Rebecca folded her hands. "Our proposal reflects those income disparities." Margaret finally looked up. "Income?" Rebecca smiled. "Yes." "Not wealth?" The room became noticeably quieter. Rebecca answered cautiously. "Current earnings are highly relevant." "They certainly are." Margaret closed the settlement proposal. "But they're not the entire financial picture." Grace spoke for the first time. "Jason has always lived on his salary." Margaret looked toward her. "I'm sure he has," Grace continued. "We've always shared expenses fairly." Jason remained completely silent. Margaret allowed Grace to keep talking. "My business supported most of our lifestyle." Another sentence. "I built my company myself." Another. "I assumed nearly all financial responsibility." Margaret quietly made a handwritten note. Rebecca noticed. "Is there a concern?" Margaret smiled pleasantly. "None whatsoever." She turned another page inside her notebook. "Please continue." Grace did. For nearly 10 minutes. She described herself as the financial foundation of the marriage. She repeated many of the same statements from the conference, only this time every word occurred inside a law office, recorded, transcribed, official. Jason watched Margaret writing continuously, never interrupting, never objecting, simply documenting. Eventually, Rebecca summarized. "My client seeks an equitable division based upon the financial realities presented." Margaret folded her notebook closed. "May I ask one question?" Rebecca nodded. "Of course." Margaret looked directly at Grace. "When exactly did you become aware of Daniel Ramirez's death?" Grace blinked. "What?" "The date." Grace hesitated briefly. "I'm not sure," Margaret continued. "Were you aware he passed away last autumn?" Grace answered carefully. "Jason mentioned it." "And were you aware probate proceedings were ongoing?" Grace looked toward Rebecca. "I don't know anything about probate." Margaret nodded. "Interesting." She opened another folder. "Because several weeks ago your investigator contacted Jason's employer." Rebecca immediately interrupted. "We retained no investigator." Margaret looked at her. "Then perhaps someone working for your client did." Grace's expression tightened. "I never hired anyone." Margaret slowly removed a business card from the folder. "Hawthorne Financial Investigations." Then another document. Employment verification request. Then another. A timeline. Phone records. Verification logs. Everything neatly organized. Rebecca studied the papers carefully. She looked toward Grace. "Did you authorize this?" Grace answered quickly. "No." Margaret observed the exchange without comment. Rebecca's confidence began fading. She realized information had reached her client unevenly. Jason quietly noticed the same thing. Someone had been gathering information, but perhaps not through Grace's attorney. Margaret spoke again. Before discussing settlement, we'd like reciprocal financial disclosure. Rebecca nodded. Naturally. Margaret handed across a formal request. Business records, corporate tax filings, consulting contracts, speaker income, investment accounts, credit lines, loan applications, corporate ownership percentages. Grace looked increasingly uncomfortable. Rebecca scanned the request. That's extensive. Margaret smiled politely. So is divorce. Rebecca closed the document. We'll review it. Margaret nodded. As will we. The meeting appeared finished. Everyone slowly stood. Then Grace unexpectedly addressed Jason directly. You could make this easy. Jason looked at her. I already am. You know I don't want a fight. Jason answered quietly. I haven't started one. Grace's voice lowered. Then don't. Jason held her gaze for several long seconds. There won't be one. She looked relieved. Then Jason added calmly, there will only be documents. Grace said nothing. Outside the building, rain continued falling over downtown Columbus. Margaret and Jason walked silently toward the parking garage. Only after reaching their vehicles did Margaret finally speak. She doesn't know. Jason understood immediately. About the trust? Margaret nodded. Neither does Rebecca. What makes you certain? Margaret smiled. Because if they knew today's proposal would have looked completely different. Jason leaned against his truck. So, what's next? Margaret opened her briefcase once more. Hawthorne delivered another report while we were upstairs. She handed him a sealed envelope. This arrived 20 minutes ago. Jason opened it carefully. Inside rested copies of several bank transfers, consulting payments, speaking fees, business deposits, nothing unusual, until the final page. One transfer stood alone, $48,000, sent 6 months earlier, from Grace's business account, to an unfamiliar company in Delaware. The recipient's name appeared in bold letters, Harbor Ridge Asset Holdings, LLC. Jason frowned. I've never heard of them, Margaret answered quietly. Neither had Hawthorne. She paused. Until yesterday. Jason looked at the next page. Corporate registration records. The company had no employees, no public office, no operating business, only one registered organizer, Daniel Foster. Jason felt his pulse slow rather than quicken. Daniel Foster. The same man Grace had repeatedly described as merely a business consultant. Margaret closed the file. I don't think Daniel Foster was ever just a consultant. Jason looked once more at the $48,000 transfer. For the first time, the divorce no longer looked like a marriage ending. It looked like the final stage of a much larger financial plan. Jason spent the next 48 hours doing something most people would have mistaken for inaction. He went to work. He answered emails. He attended engineering meetings. He ate lunch alone in the company cafeteria. Nothing about his routine changed. Only Margaret Sullivan and the investigators at Hawthorne knew that nearly every hour uncovered another piece of a puzzle no one had expected to find. Late Thursday afternoon, Margaret called. I'd like you in my office. There's something new? There are 3 new things. Jason arrived 20 minutes later. Margaret's conference table was covered with folders. Unlike previous meetings, another person sat beside her. A middle-aged man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses stood as Jason entered. Jason, this is Owen Pierce. The forensic accountant? Owen smiled. I've spent 30 years following money. Jason shook his hand. And Owen looked almost amused. Money usually tells the truth. Margaret motioned toward the chair. Sit down. Jason took his seat. Owen opened the first binder. The $48,000 transfer wasn't an isolated payment. He slid several bank records across the table. There were 6 transfers. Jason looked carefully. 48,000, 32,000, 26,000, 55,000, 39,000, 21,000. Different dates. Same destination. Harbor Ridge Asset Holdings, LLC. The total, Owen answered, $221,000. Jason remained quiet. All from Grace's consulting company. Every dollar. Margaret leaned forward, and every payment was categorized as business development expenses. Jason frowned. What business? Owen smiled thinly. Excellent question. He opened another folder. Harbor Ridge owns nothing. No employees. No products. No consulting contracts. No tax filings showing actual operations. So why send them money? Owen slid another page forward. Because shell companies rarely exist to perform work. Jason slowly read every page. The address belonged to a small office building outside Wilmington, Delaware. The registered agent handled over 600 corporations. Nothing appeared legitimate. Margaret folded her hands. Now here's where it becomes interesting. Owen produced another document. Corporate formation records. Jason immediately noticed the signature. Daniel Foster, organizer, managing member, registered representative. So Daniel owns it. Owen nodded. Officially. Jason remembered every conversation Grace had ever had regarding Daniel. She had described him as a branding strategist, a marketing advisor, a networking specialist, never a business partner, never the owner of a company receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars. Margaret spoke quietly. There's more. She handed Jason several printed invoices, professional consulting, leadership development, business expansion, marketing optimization. Each invoice matched one of the wire transfers. Every invoice looked polished, professional, convincing, until Owen pointed toward the bottom. Notice anything? Jason looked again. The invoices listed no employee names, no telephone numbers, no completed projects, only vague descriptions. They're fake, Owen answered carefully. I can't legally say fake, he paused. I can say they contain no evidence of actual work. Jason leaned back. What does Rebecca Collins know? Margaret answered first. I don't think very much. You think Grace hid this from her? I do. Jason considered the possibility. It explained Wednesday's meeting. Rebecca had negotiated from incomplete information. She genuinely believed Grace had earned everything herself. Margaret continued. Lawyers don't enjoy surprises. And this, Owen added, tapping the invoices, qualifies as a surprise. Jason looked toward the window. Rain had finally stopped outside. Sunlight reflected against nearby office buildings. He remembered Grace standing confidently on the conference stage. Every sentence she had spoken, every claim about independence, every statement about building her business alone. The words sounded different now. Not merely dishonest, strategic. Margaret interrupted his thoughts. We asked Hawthorne another question. What question? Who introduced Grace to Daniel Foster? Jason looked surprised. I assumed they met through business. So did we. Margaret slid another report across the table. The timeline disagrees. Jason read slowly. 3 years earlier. Fundraising gala. Children's Literacy Foundation. Hosted at the Westin Columbus. Guest list attached. Daniel Foster attended. Grace attended. Jason attended. Jason frowned. I don't remember meeting him. You didn't. Margaret pointed to the attendance records. You left early. Jason searched his memory. That night? His father had called unexpectedly. Daniel Ramirez had suffered chest pain. Jason had driven directly to Cincinnati. Grace stayed behind. Margaret continued. Daniel Foster remained another 3 hours. Jason stared silently at the report. The first meeting had happened without him. Owen opened another folder. We also examined Grace's company growth. What about it? It accelerated dramatically after Daniel entered the picture. Revenue doubled, then tripled, then expanded nationally. Speaking engagements multiplied. Corporate clients appeared. Magazine interviews followed. Jason studied the graphs. I thought she built those relationships herself. She may have, Owen shrugged. But Daniel certainly opened doors. Margaret quietly added one sentence. And perhaps expected something in return. Jason drove home carrying copies of the reports. For the first time in weeks, he parked several houses away. Not because anyone followed him, because he wanted to observe. Grace's SUV already sat in the driveway. Another black BMW occupied the curb. Jason immediately recognized it. Daniel Foster. The living room lights glowed warmly. Laughter drifted faintly through the front windows. Jason remained inside his truck. He checked the time. 7:18 p.m. He considered walking inside. Instead, he remembered his father's final advice. Patience creates opportunities. Emotion destroys them. He picked up his phone. Not to call Grace. To call Margaret. I'm outside. What do you see? Daniel's car. Silence. Then Margaret asked one question. Can you prove he's there? Jason looked carefully. The BMW license plate remained visible beneath the streetlight. I can photograph the car? Do that. No confrontation. Jason quietly stepped from his truck. Using the darkness between neighboring houses, he photographed the vehicle. License plate, registration sticker, street address, timestamp. Then he returned to his truck. As he prepared to leave, the front door opened. Daniel Foster stepped outside carrying a leather laptop bag. Grace followed him. Neither noticed Jason parked farther down the street. Daniel said something. Grace laughed. Then something happened neither expected. Daniel leaned forward. Not for a handshake. Not for a professional goodbye. He kissed Grace. Not briefly. Not ambiguously. A slow, familiar kiss. Jason watched without moving. His breathing remained steady. His hands stayed relaxed on the steering wheel. Grace touched Daniel's face before stepping backward. Daniel smiled, returned to his BMW, drove away. Only after his taillights disappeared did Jason quietly lower his phone. The entire exchange had been recorded. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but clearly enough. He looked at the video only once, then immediately forwarded it to Margaret. No commentary, no emotion. Just the file. Within 30 seconds, she replied, Excellent. Save multiple backups. Do not respond to Grace tonight. Jason drove aimlessly for nearly an hour, not because he needed to think, because he needed to ensure his face revealed nothing before going home. When he finally returned, Grace sat in the kitchen reviewing notes for another presentation. She smiled naturally. You're late. Jason removed his jacket. Long meeting. Everything okay? He nodded. Fine. She returned to her laptop. Jason poured himself a glass of water. Neither mentioned Daniel. Neither mentioned the divorce. The silence between them had become strangely peaceful. Not because the marriage improved, because both occupied completely different realities. Grace believed she controlled the narrative. Jason now possessed evidence she didn't even know existed. The next morning, another email arrived from Rebecca Collins. She requested updated financial disclosures before continuing settlement discussions. Margaret replied within 12 minutes. We will gladly exchange complete financial disclosures after receiving full documentation concerning Harbor Ridge Asset Holdings, LLC, all payments made thereto, and all business relationships involving Mr. Daniel Foster. Rebecca answered less than an hour later. Her email contained only one sentence. I need to speak with my client immediately. Jason read the message twice, then quietly closed his laptop. Somewhere across Columbus, Grace had just received the first question she could not answer with confidence. And for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, someone besides Jason was asking her for the truth. Rebecca Collins requested the second meeting less than 24 hours later. This time her email sounded different. No confident language, no proposed settlement. Only a single sentence. We believe an in-person discussion would be productive before exchanging further pleadings. Margaret smiled after reading it. Yesterday they negotiated. She looked at Jason. Today they're looking for information. Jason folded the email closed. Should we meet? Absolutely. When? The sooner the better. The meeting was scheduled for Monday morning. Unlike the first conference, Rebecca insisted only the attorneys and clients attend. No accountants, no investigators, no assistants. Margaret agreed. She had already obtained what she needed. Monday arrived clear and unusually warm. Jason noticed Rebecca standing outside Ashford Family Law before they entered. She appeared distracted. She greeted Margaret politely, then looked directly at Jason. Good morning. Jason nodded. Morning. Her smile seemed forced. Inside the conference room, Grace was already seated. She looked tired. Not dramatically, just enough that someone who knew her would notice. Jason had known her for 12 years. He noticed immediately. Dark circles beneath her eyes. Less makeup, coffee untouched, her confidence remained, but it required more effort. Rebecca closed the conference room door herself. No interruptions today. Margaret quietly observed everything. Grace avoided Jason's eyes. Rebecca began. Before we continue discussing property division, I'd like clarification regarding Harbor Ridge Asset Holdings, Margaret answered. We'd like clarification as well. Rebecca looked toward Grace. My client informs me Harbor Ridge provided legitimate consulting services. Margaret nodded. Excellent. She slid a yellow legal pad across the table. Then providing documentation should be simple. Rebecca looked back at Grace. Grace answered before anyone else. There are contracts. Margaret smiled. We'll need copies. There are invoices. We have those. There were strategy meetings. Margaret remained calm. Attendance records. Grace hesitated. I'd have to look. Rebecca quietly wrote something. Jason noticed it. Not the words, the speed. She had begun writing much faster than before. Margaret continued. Emails. I'm sure there are some. Deliverables? Grace paused longer. Business plans. Excellent. Margaret folded her hands. We'll request those in discovery. Silence settled over the room. Rebecca changed direction. Mr. Ramirez? Jason looked at her. Yes. My client informs me Daniel Foster has always been nothing more than a consultant. Jason answered honestly. That's what she told me. Rebecca studied his face carefully. You never questioned it. I trusted my wife. Grace shifted uncomfortably. Rebecca looked back toward her notes. And now? Jason's answer came quietly. I verify. Margaret almost smiled. Rebecca continued. Our goal remains avoiding unnecessary litigation. Margaret answered immediately. So does ours. Rebecca leaned forward. Then perhaps we can discuss settlement without expanding this matter. Margaret's expression never changed. That depends. On what? Whether there is anything left to expand. Grace looked confused. Margaret opened another folder, this one thinner than the others. She removed only 3 pages. No dramatic stacks of evidence, no photographs, only certified copies. She slid the first page across the table. Secretary of State filing. Grace frowned. Rebecca began reading immediately. Harbor Ridge Asset Holdings, LLC. Organizer. Daniel Foster. Registered member. Nothing surprising. Then Margaret slid over the second page. Amended ownership filing. Filed 8 months earlier. Rebecca's eyebrows narrowed. Grace leaned closer. The amendment listed another member, a silent investor. Ownership percentage, 49%. Rebecca looked confused. The name has been redacted. Margaret nodded. Temporarily. Grace stared at the page. Jason watched her carefully. Her breathing slowed. Margaret spoke softly. We requested judicial authorization before disclosing the remaining identity. Rebecca looked up. Why? Because the individual is unrelated to these proceedings. Grace finally spoke. Who is it? Margaret closed the folder. We'll disclose it at the appropriate time. Rebecca seemed genuinely frustrated. Withholding information doesn't help settlement, Margaret answered evenly. Neither does incomplete disclosure. Jason noticed something subtle. Grace's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. Not panic. Uncertainty. For the first time since the divorce began, she appeared unsure who actually controlled the situation. Rebecca redirected again. My client would like to move toward finalizing temporary financial arrangements. Margaret nodded. Temporary support. Yes. Rebecca opened another document. Considering the disparity in annual income, Margaret interrupted politely. Rebecca. Yes. I believe we're finished discussing annual income. Rebecca stopped. Margaret continued. From this point forward, we'll discuss net worth. The room became perfectly silent. Grace slowly looked toward Jason. He remained motionless. Margaret opened another certified envelope. This arrived Friday afternoon. She handed it directly to Rebecca. Not Grace. Rebecca reviewed the first page, then the second, then stopped. What is this? Official probate inventory. Jason recognized the document immediately. The court had finally approved the inventory filed by Daniel Ramirez's estate. Every asset appeared. Investment accounts, commercial property, corporate holdings, private equity, cash reserves, long-term trusts. Rebecca turned another page, then another. Her expression changed. She looked back toward Jason, then again toward the inventory. Grace leaned across the table. What is it? Rebecca didn't answer immediately. Instead, she quietly asked Margaret one question. Is this authentic? Margaret slid forward the certification page. Stamped by probate court. Rebecca carefully compared every seal, every signature, every page. Then she slowly closed the folder. Grace reached toward it. Rebecca placed one hand on top before Grace could open it. I'll review this first. Grace looked surprised. I'd like to see it. Rebecca answered firmly. In a moment. Jason watched everything without speaking. Margaret remained equally silent. Rebecca finally asked the question she had apparently avoided since receiving Friday's email. When exactly did Mr. Ramirez become beneficiary? Margaret answered. Last October. Rebecca inhaled slowly. And your client disclosed this to his wife? Jason answered before Margaret could. She never asked. Grace looked toward him immediately. You inherited something. Jason met her eyes. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? He answered honestly. I tried. The room fell quiet. Jason remembered the evening perfectly. He had returned from Cincinnati carrying probate paperwork. Grace had been preparing for a conference in Atlanta. He had said they needed to discuss his father's estate. She had answered without looking up from her laptop. If it's about money, just handle it. He never raised the subject again. Margaret quietly spoke. Jason respected your wishes. Grace stared at him. You let me believe, Jason answered calmly. You decided what to believe. Rebecca finally opened the inventory again. She turned directly to the summary page. Estimated gross estate value, $26,400,000. The number remained visible only seconds. Long enough. Grace saw it. Her face lost color. She looked back toward Jason, then again toward the document. No. The word escaped almost involuntarily. No. Jason remained still. Margaret said nothing. Rebecca slowly closed the folder once more. Grace whispered. 26 million, Margaret corrected gently. Gross estate. Grace looked confused. So, not all transferred directly. Rebecca finally regained her composure. What portion passed to Mr. Ramirez? Margaret answered carefully. Enough that spousal support calculations have become substantially more complicated. Rebecca almost laughed. That's one way to describe it. Grace looked at Jason as though seeing someone entirely unfamiliar. You've been wealthy, Jason answered with absolute precision. No, he paused. My father was. Another pause. Now I'm responsible for what he left. Grace leaned backward, almost unconsciously. Everything she believed about the divorce had shifted. Not because Jason suddenly became a different man, because she realized he had remained exactly the same. Quiet, simple, reserved. The only thing that changed was her understanding. Rebecca slowly gathered every document into a neat stack. She looked directly at Margaret. I think my client and I require a private discussion. Margaret nodded. Of course. Grace looked almost desperate. Rebecca stood. 5 minutes. She escorted Grace into a smaller adjoining office. The door closed behind them. Jason remained seated. Neither he nor Margaret spoke. After nearly 2 minutes, muffled voices became audible through the wall. Not words, only tone. Grace's voice, faster, higher. Rebecca's, lower, controlled. Then silence. Margaret quietly looked at Jason. She's learning something. What? Margaret smiled faintly. That lawyers don't like being surprised by their own clients. 5 minutes became 10. 10 became 15. Finally, the conference room door opened. Rebecca returned alone. Grace remained inside. Rebecca's posture had completely changed. Professional, but colder. She placed both hands on the table. Mr. Ramirez. Yes. I owe you an apology. Jason looked surprised. For what? For assuming facts that should have been verified independently. Jason nodded once. Accepted. Rebecca looked toward Margaret. We'll be amending our filings. Margaret answered. I expected you would. Rebecca collected her briefcase. The divorce is no longer the only issue that concerns me. Jason noticed the significance immediately. She wasn't talking about property anymore. She was talking about conduct. And somewhere behind the closed office door, Grace still had no idea that the inheritance wasn't the most dangerous secret waiting to surface. The Harbor Ridge investigation had only just begun. The call from Margaret came at 6:40 Tuesday morning. Jason had just poured his first cup of coffee when his phone vibrated. He answered immediately. Good morning. Margaret skipped the greeting. Rebecca withdrew 3 motions overnight. Jason sat down. Which ones? The temporary spousal support request. The demand for exclusive possession of the marital residence. And the motion accusing you of concealing marital assets. Jason allowed himself a slow breath. So she believes me now. Margaret answered carefully. She believes the evidence. There was a difference. Jason appreciated that. Anything else? Yes. Margaret's voice became quieter. Rebecca also requested copies of every document Hawthorne has gathered. I thought discovery hadn't started. It hasn't. So why ask? Because she's worried. Jason looked through the kitchen window toward the quiet Columbus street. Worried about what? Margaret paused. I don't think she's worried about losing the divorce anymore. I think she's worried about representing a client who hasn't been truthful. Jason remembered Rebecca's expression after seeing the probate inventory. She had looked surprised. Yesterday she had looked concerned. Those were not the same emotion. "I'll come by your office." 10 o'clock. When Jason arrived, Owen Pierce and 2 Hawthorne investigators were already waiting. Large monitors displayed timelines, financial charts, and property records. Margaret pointed toward the screen. "We've identified the 49% owner." Jason looked immediately. The name surprised him. It wasn't Grace. It wasn't another corporation. It wasn't someone he'd ever heard before. Emily Warren, age 68, retired elementary school teacher, living in Asheville, North Carolina. Jason frowned. "I don't understand." "Neither did we." Owen smiled. "Until yesterday." He opened another file. Emily Warren had inherited the ownership interest from her late husband. Harold Warren, a venture capitalist who had quietly financed dozens of startup companies over 3 decades. Harold died 2 years earlier. Emily inherited everything, including minority interests she barely understood. Jason asked the obvious question. "So what does she have to do with Daniel?" Owen tapped another page. "Harold invested in Daniel Foster 15 years ago. He retained 49% ownership. When Harold died, Emily inherited that stake." Jason slowly nodded. "So Daniel never fully controlled Harbor Ridge." "Correct," Margaret added another detail. "And Emily has no relationship with Grace." Jason considered the implication. "If Emily cooperates..." Owen finished the thought. "We obtain every company record." Margaret smiled. "She already has." Jason looked up. "What?" Margaret handed him a signed affidavit. Emily Warren had voluntarily agreed to produce internal financial records after learning that her ownership interest might be connected to pending litigation. "No subpoena, no." "Why?" Margaret answered simply. "She values her reputation." Owen opened the first accounting ledger. Every payment into Harbor Ridge, every payment leaving Harbor Ridge, every month, 5 years of records. Jason leaned forward. The entries appeared surprisingly organized. Daniel Foster liked documentation. He simply never expected someone else to possess copies. Owen highlighted one recurring transaction. Incoming payment. Grace Ellis Consulting. Outgoing payment. Foster Strategic Partners. Another transaction. Incoming payment. Grace Ellis Consulting. Outgoing payment. Luxury condominium mortgage. Miami. Another. Incoming payment. Grace Ellis Consulting. Outgoing payment. Mercedes Financial Services. Jason looked quietly at the totals. "What percentage stayed inside Harbor Ridge?" Owen answered. "Very little." "So it was a pass-through company." "Exactly." Margaret spoke carefully. "Jason." "Yes." "We found something else." She displayed another spreadsheet. Travel expenses. Chicago, Dallas, Miami, Nashville, Seattle. Repeated destinations. Repeated hotel names. Repeated dates. Jason noticed something. Many trips matched conferences Grace had attended. He frowned. "I thought these were speaking events?" "They were." "So why is Harbor Ridge paying hotel expenses?" Owen answered. "Excellent question." Margaret zoomed in on one line. The Blackstone Hotel, Chicago, 3 nights, 2 guests, single suite. Jason remained silent. Another. The Jewel, Dallas. 2 nights, executive suite. Another. The Fontainebleau, Miami, 4 nights, oceanfront residence. Every reservation carried Daniel Foster's corporate credit card. Every reimbursement originated from Harbor Ridge. And many matched dates when Grace had claimed to be traveling alone. Jason didn't interrupt. He simply watched. Margaret understood why. The betrayal had already become obvious. No additional commentary was necessary. Then Owen produced the final report. "This one concerns communication." Phone records. Not content. Only metadata, calls, durations, dates. Jason recognized Grace's number immediately. Over 1,400 calls. Daniel Foster, 5 years, average duration 23 minutes, late evenings, weekends, holiday mornings, Christmas Day, Thanksgiving, anniversary weekends. Jason quietly looked away from the screen, not because he doubted the evidence, because memories suddenly rearranged themselves. Grace answering calls while standing outside family dinners, business emergency, Grace leaving restaurants, important client, Grace stepping into another room on Christmas morning. Quick consultation. Every explanation had sounded reasonable. One by one, they disappeared. Margaret allowed several moments of silence. Finally, she asked, "Would you like a break?" Jason shook his head. "No." "You sure?" "I'd rather know everything." Owen nodded respectfully. "There's one last item." He opened an audio transcript. Not recordings, voicemail logs. Daniel had accidentally preserved cloud backups during a phone migration. Only 3 survived. The audio quality remained poor, but the transcripts were clear. Jason picked up the first page. Daniel's voice. "I transferred the invoice. Check your account before Friday. Grace. I'll handle Jason." Jason read slowly. Second message. Daniel. "Rebecca says timing matters." Grace. "She still thinks Jason doesn't know." Third message. Daniel. "If Sullivan gets involved, everything changes." Grace answered. "She won't." The recording ended. No dramatic confession. No declaration of love. No explicit fraud. Only enough to demonstrate coordination. Enough to establish knowledge. Enough to destroy credibility. Jason carefully returned the transcript. "I don't need to hear the recordings." Margaret nodded. "I wouldn't either." Her phone rang. She answered immediately. After listening for nearly 30 seconds, she muted the speaker. "It's Rebecca." Jason waited. Margaret unmuted. "Go ahead." Rebecca's voice sounded unusually formal. "I've spoken with my client." Margaret remained calm. "And there will be amended financial disclosures." "When? Within 48 hours?" Margaret asked another question. "Complete disclosures." A pause. "That's my expectation." Margaret looked toward Jason. "We've also received additional accounting records." Another pause. "I suspected you had." Rebecca sounded tired. "Margaret?" "Yes." "If my client wishes to negotiate, will your client consider mediation before trial?" Margaret looked toward Jason. He answered quietly. "If everything is disclosed." Margaret repeated the condition. Rebecca exhaled slowly. "I'll discuss it with her." The call ended. Owen leaned back. "Interesting." Jason agreed. "She didn't threaten." "No." Margaret closed her notebook. She asked. That afternoon, Jason returned to work. For nearly 4 hours, he forgot the divorce entirely. He reviewed bridge load calculations, approved supplier revisions, discussed safety inspections. Life at least temporarily resembled normal. Until his assistant walked into his office. "Jason." "Yeah." "Someone's here asking for you." "Who?" "I don't know." Jason walked toward reception. Grace sat alone in the waiting area. No attorney. No designer clothes. No makeup beyond the basics. She stood as soon as she saw him. "I need 5 minutes." Jason looked around. Employees quietly pretended not to notice. He nodded toward an empty conference room. Inside, Grace remained standing. "So," Jason waited. "I know about your father's estate." He said nothing. "I didn't know." "I believe you." She looked relieved for only a second, then asked, "Why didn't you fight back?" Jason frowned. "What do you mean, when everyone believed you were broke?" "When my friends laughed. When people assumed I paid for everything. You never corrected them. Jason answered honestly. Nobody asked me. Grace looked down. I should have. Yes. Silence stretched between them. Finally, she looked back up. Are you trying to destroy me? Jason answered without hesitation. No. Then why does it feel like everything is falling apart? He spoke quietly. Because truth arrives all at once. Grace's eyes became moist. I made mistakes. Jason nodded. I know. You don't understand. No. He met her eyes. I understand exactly enough. Grace opened her mouth to continue. Instead, she whispered, Daniel lied to me. Jason watched her carefully. It was the first time she had admitted Daniel's name voluntarily. But before he could ask what she meant, Grace reached into her purse, removed a small, sealed envelope, and placed it on the conference table. You need to see this before anyone else does. She turned and walked away without another word. Jason waited until the reception doors closed behind her. Only then did he look down at the envelope. Across the front, in Daniel Foster's handwriting, were 6 words. If anything happens, give Jason this. Jason did not open the envelope inside the conference room. He carried it back to his office, closed the door, and simply looked at it for nearly 5 minutes. The cream-colored paper had yellowed slightly. The handwriting was unmistakably Daniel Foster's. Firm, precise, confident. Across the seal, another sentence had been written in blue ink. Only if Grace gives this to you herself. Jason immediately understood why the instruction mattered. Daniel had not intended this letter to become evidence through a subpoena or police search. He had expected Grace to make a decision, whether she delivered it or destroyed it. She had chosen to deliver it. That choice alone meant something had changed. Jason called Margaret before breaking the seal. I have something. What kind of something? He explained the envelope. Her answer came immediately. Don't open it. I already have it. I know. Bring it here. 30 minutes later, the envelope rested on Margaret Sullivan's conference table. She photographed every side before touching it. One investigator recorded the process. Another noted the exact time. Chain of custody. If the contents became evidence, no one would question authenticity. Margaret finally nodded. Open it. Jason carefully slid a letter opener beneath the flap. Inside were 3 items. A handwritten letter, a USB flash drive, 1 folded bank receipt. No one spoke. Jason unfolded the letter first. It began without greeting. Jason. If you're reading this, then Grace finally realized I was never planning to protect her. That single sentence froze the room. Jason continued reading silently. Daniel explained that Harbor Ridge had never been created for consulting. It had been designed to move money between legitimate contracts while disguising personal spending as business expenses. He admitted using the company for years. Then came the next paragraph. Grace believed the company existed to reduce taxes. She never asked enough questions. I never volunteered enough answers. Margaret quietly extended her hand. May I? Jason nodded. She continued reading aloud. If investigators ever start looking, they'll follow the money to me first. If that happens, Grace will become convenient collateral. She knows enough to be dangerous, but not enough to defend herself. Jason remained expressionless. Margaret continued. She honestly believes our relationship was built on trust. It wasn't. It was built on leverage. Silence filled the conference room. The next paragraph changed everything. Jason, you're probably the only honest person involved in this entire mess. That's why this envelope exists. If Grace gives it to you willingly, she finally understands who I really am. If someone else gives it to you, don't trust them. Jason slowly looked toward the flash drive. Margaret already understood. We'll examine that separately. The folded receipt came next. It documented a cashier's check, $320,000, issued 14 months earlier, payable to Harbor Ridge Asset Holdings, purchaser, Daniel Foster, memo line, Grace Ellis Home Purchase Reserve. Jason frowned. Home purchase. Margaret opened another file. Grace had once mentioned wanting to buy a vacation property. Nothing ever happened. At least nothing Jason knew about. Owen Pierce examined the receipt carefully. The account number? What about it? It doesn't belong to Harbor Ridge. Everyone looked at him. It belongs to another company. He typed rapidly. Within seconds, another corporate registration appeared. Blue Cedar Investments, LLC. Registered owner. Daniel Foster. Jason slowly exhaled. So, Harbor Ridge wasn't the only company. No. Owen continued searching. There are four shell companies, each registered in different states, each handling different categories of transactions. Margaret looked toward Jason. The investigation just became significantly larger. The flash drive required forensic imaging before anyone viewed its contents. An outside specialist completed the process that afternoon. No files were altered, no metadata changed. By 5 o'clock, everyone gathered again. The first folder contained accounting spreadsheets. The second contained scanned contracts. The third contained hundreds of emails. The fourth simply read, insurance. Jason frowned. Insurance. The first document answered immediately. Life insurance, Daniel Foster. Policy value. $10 million. Primary beneficiary, Grace Ellis. The room became completely silent. Jason read the page twice. He hadn't misunderstood. Grace was listed as beneficiary. Margaret looked equally surprised. When was this issued? Owen checked. 3 years ago. Jason quietly shook his head. She never mentioned it. No? Margaret's expression became thoughtful. Neither did Daniel. Another document followed. Policy amendment, beneficiary removed. 8 months earlier. Replacement beneficiary, Daniel Foster Family Trust. Jason frowned. So he changed it. Apparently. Without telling Grace. The next file explained why. Internal emails between Daniel and his financial advisor. One sentence stood out. Remove Grace immediately. Divorce exposure has increased. Jason leaned back. Grace had never been protected. She had simply believed she was. The realization cast every previous decision in a different light. Margaret closed the insurance folder. Jason? Yes. If Grace never knew about this, then she wasn't working toward the future she thought she had. Margaret nodded. Exactly. There was another folder. Personal. Inside were photographs. Not romantic photographs. Business meetings, restaurants, private lounges, hotel conference rooms, Daniel with investors, Daniel with accountants, Daniel with politicians. Grace appeared in only a handful. Always sitting nearby, always smiling, always believing she belonged among them. Jason recognized the expression. It wasn't arrogance. It was aspiration. Daniel had offered her access to a world she desperately wanted. He had never intended to share ownership of it. The final folder contained voice memos, dozens of them, personal reminders Daniel had recorded for himself while driving. The forensic team converted each into transcripts. One memo immediately drew attention. If Grace starts asking about ownership percentages, redirect her toward expansion plans. Another, never let her meet Emily Warren. Another, Jason Ramirez remains useful because he never investigates anything. Jason read that sentence twice. Not because it hurt, because it was true. He hadn't investigated. He had trusted. The final transcript ended abruptly. Need to move assets before Sullivan gets involved. Margaret slowly lowered the page. He knew my name. Owen nodded. He'd been monitoring legal risk. Jason remained quiet. His phone suddenly vibrated. Grace. He looked toward Margaret. She nodded. Answer? Jason accepted the call. Hello? Grace sounded exhausted. Did you open it? Yes. A long silence. I'm sorry. Jason waited. I didn't know about most of it. He believed that. Not because of emotion, because the documents supported it. What do you want, Grace? Another pause. I want to tell the truth. All of it. Everything I actually know. Margaret immediately wrote 2 words on her legal pad. Witness interview. Jason understood. When? Tonight. Where? Not my apartment. Why? Daniel has keys. Jason frowned. What? I didn't realize he kept copies. Jason looked toward Margaret. Her expression hardened immediately. Grace continued. I went home this afternoon. My file cabinet had been opened. My laptop was gone. The security alarm had been disabled. Jason spoke quietly. Call the police. I already did. They said nothing valuable appeared missing. But something was. What? My journal. Jason became still. You kept one? Yes. For years. What was in it? Everything. She began crying softly. Every meeting. Every trip. Every promise Daniel made. Every argument we had. Everything. Margaret whispered, Ask if she has backups. Jason did. Grace answered. No. The line remained silent for several seconds. Then Grace said something unexpected. I think Daniel knows I'm talking. Jason looked toward Margaret again. Why? Because someone followed me from my apartment. Who? I don't know. Where are you now? I'm sitting inside St. Mark's Church parking lot. Jason's voice became firmer. Stay there. I'm sending someone. Margaret was already dialing another number. Within 2 minutes, one of Hawthorne's investigators left the building. Grace remained on the phone. Jason listened quietly. She sounded frightened. Not performative, not manipulative, simply frightened. Then another voice interrupted. Male. Muffled. Grace suddenly whispered, Someone just pulled into the parking lot. Jason stood. What do you see? A black SUV. No plates on the front. It just stopped. Margaret immediately signaled everyone to remain silent. Jason spoke calmly. Lock your doors. I already did. What are they doing? Grace answered almost inaudibly. They're not getting out. Another pause. They're just watching. Jason heard her breathing become faster. Then headlights flashed twice. The black SUV slowly backed away, turned, and disappeared into traffic. Grace whispered one final sentence before ending the call. I don't think Daniel is trying to protect himself anymore. I think he's trying to erase every witness. Grace refused to leave the church parking lot until she saw someone she recognized. 22 minutes after the call ended, a dark blue Hawthorne security SUV turned slowly through the entrance. Its headlights flashed once. The driver stepped out with both hands visible before approaching her vehicle. Grace unlocked the doors only after he showed his identification through the window. Jason remained inside Margaret Sullivan's office, waiting. No one spoke while the investigator escorted Grace to a secure location across town. Margaret finally received a text message. Safe. Interview beginning in 30 minutes. She looked at Jason. She's secure. Jason nodded once. For now. Margaret understood what he meant. Daniel Foster had spent years building companies that existed only on paper. People like that rarely accepted losing control gracefully, especially when financial records began surfacing. An hour later, Grace arrived through a private entrance at Sullivan and Pierce. She looked nothing like the confident keynote speaker from the convention. Her hair remained tied back carelessly. She wore jeans, a plain gray sweater, and a dark coat that looked hastily borrowed. She carried no purse, only a small canvas tote. When she entered the conference room, her eyes immediately found Jason. Neither smiled. Neither looked away. Margaret broke the silence. Grace, before we begin, understand something. Grace nodded quietly. This meeting is voluntary. Yes. Everything you say may become part of legal proceedings. I understand. If you intentionally misrepresent facts, we stop immediately. Grace took a slow breath. I don't want to lie anymore. Margaret activated a digital recorder. State your full name. Grace Elizabeth Ramirez? The date, Grace answered. Then Margaret asked the first real question. When did you first meet Daniel Foster? Grace stared at the tabletop for several seconds. 3 years ago. Where? Children's Literacy Foundation fundraiser. Jason immediately recognized the event. The same evening, he had driven to Cincinnati after his father's medical emergency. Grace continued. I was standing alone after one of the speeches. He introduced himself. What did he say? He complimented my presentation. He told me I deserved larger clients. She laughed softly. I believed him. Margaret asked carefully, what happened next? He invited me to lunch. Business. At first. Grace rubbed her hands together. He knew everyone. Corporate executives. Investors. Marketing firms. He introduced me to people I never could have reached alone. Jason listened without interruption. The narrator noticed something important. Grace no longer defended herself. She described events almost clinically, as though she had already accepted that excuses no longer mattered. Margaret continued. When did Harbor Ridge enter the picture? Grace frowned. About 6 months later. What were you told? That Daniel needed a consulting company to process partnership agreements. What did you believe? That it reduced taxes. Margaret asked another question. Did you ever ask to see financial statements? Grace shook her head. No. Why not? I trusted him. Jason lowered his eyes briefly. The sentence echoed painfully, not because Grace spoke it, because he had once said the same thing. Margaret continued methodically. When did your relationship become personal? Grace closed her eyes. About 2 years ago. She did not elaborate. Margaret didn't ask her to. Only facts mattered. Did Daniel ever promise marriage? Yes. Did he discuss divorcing his wife? Grace looked surprised. He wasn't married. Margaret quietly slid a document across the table. Certified marriage certificate, Daniel Foster, married to Catherine Foster, 21 years. Grace stared at it. No. Her voice barely emerged. No. Margaret remained silent. Grace picked up the document with trembling hands. This isn't possible. It is. He told me. Her words stopped. She read the certificate again, then the county seal, then the filing date. Jason watched her carefully. Nothing about her reaction appeared rehearsed. Margaret finally asked, You didn't know? Grace slowly shook her head. He said they divorced years ago. Owen Pierce quietly placed another photograph beside the certificate. Daniel. Catherine. 2 teenage daughters. Family charity gala. 3 months earlier. Grace looked away. I never met them. No, Margaret answered. He made certain you wouldn't. Grace covered her face with both hands. For nearly a minute, no one spoke. When she finally looked up again, tears remained visible. I was an idiot, Margaret answered calmly. You were manipulated. Grace looked toward Jason. I betrayed you. Jason answered honestly. Both can be true. She nodded. I know. Margaret resumed the interview. Did Daniel ever discuss Jason's inheritance? Grace immediately answered. No. Never. Never. When did you first learn Daniel knew about it? Grace thought carefully. About 6 months ago. What happened? He asked whether Jason ever talked about his father's estate. What did you tell him? That Jason never discussed money? Margaret made another note. How did Daniel respond? Grace remembered almost word for word. He smiled. He said quiet men were predictable. Jason recognized the sentence immediately. Daniel had underestimated silence. He had mistaken restraint for ignorance. Margaret leaned forward. Did Daniel encourage your public speeches? Yes. Did he help write them? Grace hesitated. Some of them. What percentage? Most. Jason looked up. Grace continued before anyone asked. He always said successful stories needed a villain. Margaret remained expressionless. And who became the villain? Grace looked directly at Jason. You. Silence settled heavily across the room. Grace swallowed. The first speech wasn't true. The second exaggerated. After that, she shook her head. I stopped noticing the difference. Jason finally spoke. Why? Grace answered immediately. Because people applauded. She looked ashamed. They believed I built everything myself. They admired me. I liked it. She laughed bitterly. I thought I earned it. Margaret quietly asked, Did Daniel benefit financially from your speaking career? Grace nodded. He negotiated nearly every contract. What percentage? 30%. Owen checked several spreadsheets. It matches, Grace continued. I thought it was management fees. It wasn't. No. She looked towards the accounting reports. It never was. Margaret turned off the recorder briefly. Grace. Yes. Is there anything we've missed? Grace stared toward the window. There is one thing. She opened the canvas tote she had carried inside. From the bottom, she removed an old spiral notebook. Jason frowned. I thought your journal was stolen. It was. This isn't the journal. What is it? Grace placed the notebook on the table. My appointment book. Every page contained dates, meeting locations, flight numbers, restaurant reservations, conference schedules, phone numbers. Unlike the missing journal, this notebook contained no opinions, only facts. Margaret immediately understood its value. This establishes timelines. Grace nodded. I never threw it away. She opened to a page dated 18 months earlier. Next to one meeting appeared a handwritten note. Emily W. finally wants records. Jason looked immediately toward Margaret. Emily Warren, the silent 49% owner. Grace continued. I asked Daniel who Emily was. What did he say? He told me never to ask again. Margaret copied the page. Then another. Another notation appeared. Move Ramirez story public before probate closes. Jason slowly read the sentence. Grace looked horrified. I didn't write that. Margaret examined the handwriting carefully. It isn't yours. Grace nodded. Daniel borrowed my notebook during lunch that day. He must have written it. Owen compared the handwriting to Daniel's letter from the envelope. Within seconds, he looked up. It's identical. The room fell completely silent. Daniel Foster had unknowingly left behind a handwritten timeline linking Jason's public humiliation to the period immediately before Daniel Ramirez's estate closed. Not proof of every allegation, but proof of planning. Margaret carefully closed the notebook. She looked at Jason. I think we're finished waiting. Jason understood. For what? Margaret's voice remained calm. For the file your father told me never to open until someone else made the first move. She stood and walked toward the fireproof archive at the back of her office. Inside rested a single cream-colored envelope, 12 years old, still sealed. Across the front, Daniel Ramirez had written only 6 words. Open only after deception becomes undeniable. Margaret placed the envelope gently on the conference table. No one reached for it, because everyone in the room understood one thing. Whatever waited inside had been prepared long before Grace met Daniel Foster. And Daniel Ramirez had somehow anticipated that one day the truth would need more than witnesses. It would need a file. The sealed envelope remained untouched for several long moments. No one in the conference room. Daniel Ramirez had written those 6 words open, only after Dec Margaret Sully. This Jason L. No. It was created for. Margaret nodded. He never. She carefully examined the unlike the previous envelope from Daniel Foster. This one contained no electronic storage, the only paper, several neatly faux one handwritten letter, 2 notarized affidavits, a certified trust memorandum, and Margaret Emidi, Thomas Ellison. Jason looked at You Knew Him. He was one of Margaret unfolded the handwritten, let the handwriting felt different from Da Steady. Patient. Every line seemed written by someone who believed time would eventually reveal what people tried to hide. She began reading aloud. Jason. If this envelope has been opened, it means someone attempted to me. If that has happened, remember one thing. Never defend yourself with anger. Jason lowered his eyes. Those adaluididu, Margaret continued, money attracts 2 kinds of people, those who respect responsibility and those who pursue appearance. The difference often takes years to recognize. Do not waste energy convincing anyone which kind they are. Their own decisions will eventually answer that question for you. Grace quietly wiped away another tear. The letter never mentioned her. Never mentioned Daniel Foster. Yet every sentence seemed directed toward the situation now unfolding. The final paragraph read, I chose not to tell many people what I owned because I wanted to know who remained when ownership no longer impressed them. If you have reached this day, then you already possess the answer. Do not seek revenge. Seek clarity. Justice belongs to evidence, not emotion. Love, Dad. The room remained silent after Margaret finished. Jason stared at the familiar signature. For the first time since his father's death, he felt as though Daniel Ramirez had entered the room again. Not as a memory, as guidance. Margaret carefully folded the letter. Then she opened the notarized affidavits. The first documented the creation of the family trust. Nothing surprising. The second immediately captured everyone's attention. It described Daniel Ramirez's explicit instructions to his legal team. Should any beneficiary become involved in litigation where financial misrepresentation or false public statements materially affect legal proceedings, counsel is authorized to disclose trust documentation necessary to correct the record. Margaret looked up. He anticipated something remarkably specific. Jason frowned. My father thought someone would lie about money, Margaret answered honestly. I think he believed success often attracts that possibility. She unfolded the final legal opinion. Thomas Ellison had written only 3 pages. Every paragraph analyzed one principle. Privacy, not secrecy. The opinion explained that choosing not to advertise wealth created no legal obligation to correct assumptions made by strangers. Jason quietly smiled. So I never had a duty to announce anything? No. Margaret looked directly at Grace. Nor to correct every story told about you. Grace nodded slowly. I understand now. No. She shook her own head. I finally understand. The interview ended shortly afterward. Margaret asked Hawthorne investigators to preserve every document. Grace voluntarily signed a sworn statement confirming that the notebook conference speeches and business records accurately reflected her knowledge. Nothing had been forced. Everything had been documented. As everyone prepared to leave, Rebecca Collins arrived unexpectedly. She entered carrying only a slim legal folder. I hope I'm not interrupting. Margaret invited her inside. Rebecca looked around the room before speaking. I've withdrawn as Daniel Foster's counsel in every unrelated matter my firm handled. Jason looked surprised. I didn't know your firm represented him. We did, she answered quietly. Very briefly. Not anymore. Margaret understood immediately. Conflict concerns? Rebecca nodded. Among other things. She turned toward Grace. I also received amended financial disclosures this morning. Grace frowned. I didn't send anything. You didn't. Rebecca opened the folder. They were filed electronically under your account credentials at 2:17 this morning. Everyone became still. What? Rebecca handed over several pages. The filing attempted to amend business records, transfer ownership, reclassify consulting expenses, correct prior accounting descriptions. Every change benefited Daniel Foster, not Grace. Grace stared at the documents. I've never seen these, Rebecca answered calmly. I believe you. Margaret immediately examined the electronic signature information. Different IP address, different device, different location. Someone had impersonated Grace after realizing the investigation had expanded. Jason quietly asked, Can that be traced? Rebecca nodded. It already has. She turned another page. The filing originated from a private office inside Harbor Ridge's registered address. Owen Pierce looked toward Margaret. So he panicked. Margaret corrected gently. He made a mistake. There was an important difference. Panic produced mistakes. Preparation revealed them. Before anyone spoke again, Margaret's office phone rang. She answered, listened, then thanked the caller. After hanging up, she looked toward everyone. Emily Warren has agreed to testify. Grace looked confused. The investor? Yes. Margaret smiled slightly. Apparently, she has wanted to meet Daniel Foster in court for nearly 2 years. Jason asked why. Margaret handed him another affidavit. Emily had repeatedly requested access to Harbor Ridge's accounting records. Daniel delayed every meeting, ignored every request, provided incomplete reports. Finally, she hired independent auditors. The audit had begun only weeks before Hawthorne contacted her. Jason slowly understood. Daniel hadn't been hiding from only one investigation. Multiple people had begun asking questions simultaneously. His carefully managed world had started collapsing before Jason even knew a divorce was coming. 3 days later, mediation officially began. Unlike the earlier meetings, this one took place inside the Franklin County Courthouse. Not because trial had started, because both legal teams believed a judge might eventually need immediate access if negotiations failed. Jason entered first with Margaret. Grace arrived separately beside Rebecca. Neither Daniel nor anyone representing him appeared. The mediator, Judge Harold Brennan, welcomed everyone calmly. My goal is resolution, Margaret answered. Our goal is truth. Rebecca nodded. I believe those goals now overlap. For several hours, financial issues were discussed. The marital residence, retirement accounts, business interests, personal property. Jason agreed to every reasonable proposal. Grace requested very little. By mid-afternoon, Judge Brennan paused the session. I've reviewed enough to make one observation. Everyone looked toward him. This case began as a financial dispute. He closed the folder in front of him. It is no longer one. Neither attorney disagreed. Grace quietly spoke. I don't want anything Jason inherited. Jason looked toward her. I never did, Grace continued. I only wanted people to believe I'd become successful. She laughed sadly. I confused admiration with respect. No one interrupted. Judge Brennan simply listened. Grace looked directly at Jason. I spent years trying to prove I didn't need you. Her voice remained steady. I never realized I had stopped seeing who you actually were. Jason answered gently. I stopped recognizing you too. The words carried no anger, only truth. The mediator allowed several moments of silence. Sometimes silence resolved more than arguments. Rebecca finally placed one final document onto the table. A revised settlement. Margaret reviewed every page carefully, then handed it to Jason. He read slowly. No unreasonable demands, no hidden language, no attempt to exploit his inheritance, only a fair division of marital assets accumulated during the marriage. Jason signed. Grace signed moments later. Neither looked relieved. Some endings arrived too late for relief. They only brought acceptance. As everyone prepared to leave, a court officer entered the mediation room carrying a sealed evidence packet. He addressed Margaret. "Counselor Sullivan." "Yes." "You've been served with notice." Margaret accepted the packet. She read only the first page before looking toward Jason. "What is it?" Margaret slowly closed the envelope. "The United States Attorney's Office has opened a formal investigation involving Daniel Foster and several associated entities." Grace quietly sat back down. Rebecca exhaled slowly. Margaret looked once more at Daniel Ramirez's handwritten letter resting inside her briefcase. Justice belongs to evidence, not emotion. For months, Jason had resisted every temptation to defend himself through arguments. Now the evidence had moved beyond the divorce. The truth no longer belonged only to Jason and Grace. It belonged to the legal system. And for the first time since Grace had told the world her husband was broke, Jason realized he no longer cared what strangers believed. The only people still speaking were those under oath. The federal investigation became public 3 weeks later. It did not begin with dramatic headlines or television cameras. It began with a quiet filing in the United States District Court. Then came subpoenas, then interviews, then records that had once been scattered across accounting firms, conference organizers, banks, and corporate registries were finally examined together instead of separately. Jason followed none of it closely. That surprised even Margaret Sullivan. She stopped by his office one Friday afternoon carrying 2 folders. "You haven't asked for an update." Jason smiled faintly. "I hired you because I don't need to." Margaret sat across from him. "Most clients call every day." "I'm not most clients." "No," she smiled. "You're certainly not." She opened the thinner folder first. "The divorce decree was entered this morning." Jason accepted the certified copy. 1 signature from the judge, 1 case number, 1 marriage officially ended. No celebration, no bitterness, just an ending. Margaret watched him read the final page. "How do you feel?" Jason thought for several seconds before answering. "Lighter." She nodded. "I expected anger. I already carried that. And it was heavier than forgiveness." Margaret quietly closed the folder. "The second file concerns Daniel Foster." Jason looked up. "I'm listening." "The federal investigation has expanded." She chose her words carefully. "There are multiple financial charges being pursued." Jason asked no further questions. Margaret noticed. "You don't want details." He shook his head. "Justice isn't my job." It never was. She smiled. "Your father would probably approve of that answer." Jason looked toward the framed photograph on his bookshelf. Daniel Ramirez stood beside an old steel bridge the company had completed nearly 20 years earlier. His father had never measured success by attention, only by permanence. Some structures remained standing long after the people who built them disappeared. Perhaps character worked the same way. A week later, Grace requested one final meeting. Not through attorneys, not through formal correspondence. She sent a brief handwritten note. "If you're willing, I'd like to return something that belongs to your family." No expectations. No arguments. Jason agreed. They met on a quiet Sunday afternoon inside Franklin Park Conservatory. The gardens remained peaceful despite the early autumn visitors. Children ran through fountains. Families wandered among flowers. No one recognized either of them. Grace arrived carrying a small wooden box. It looked old, carefully restored. She placed it on the bench between them. "I found this while packing." Jason opened the lid. Inside rested his father's old pocket watch, the one Daniel Ramirez had carried nearly every day. Jason had searched for it after the funeral. He never found it. "I thought it was lost." Grace looked down. "I packed it away years ago." "You forgot." She nodded slowly. I forgot a lot of things. Jason lifted the watch carefully. The back cover contained an engraving. Build things that outlast applause. He smiled sadly. Dad loved that sentence. Grace looked toward the greenhouse ceiling. I didn't understand him. Jason closed the watch gently. Most people didn't. She hesitated before speaking again. I've started working with investigators. I know. I'm telling the truth. I know. She laughed softly. You already know everything. Jason looked at her. No. There are still things only you know. Grace remained quiet. Then she asked the question she had carried for weeks. Can you ever forgive me? Jason did not answer immediately. The narrator understood why. Forgiveness was not a decision made in one sentence. It was the result of many smaller decisions made over time. Finally, Jason spoke. I already stopped hating you. Grace's eyes filled with tears. That's not the same. No, it isn't. Another long silence settled between them, but it's where forgiveness starts. Grace nodded. I don't expect anything more. Jason believed her. Not because she sounded convincing, because she no longer sounded like someone trying to convince anyone. She had stopped performing. For the first time in years, she simply spoke. I kept thinking success meant people admiring me. She smiled sadly. I didn't notice I was becoming someone I wouldn't have admired myself. Jason looked across the gardens. My father used to tell me something. What? The loudest reputation isn't always the strongest one. Grace laughed quietly. That sounds exactly like him. It does? She stood to leave. After a few steps, she turned back. Jason. Yeah, I really did love you. He answered honestly. I know. She looked surprised. I just forgot how to protect it. Jason watched her disappear into the crowd. There was no dramatic goodbye, no embrace. Some relationships ended not because love never existed, but because pride eventually spoke louder than it. Months passed. Winter arrived. Jason accepted a position leading infrastructure projects across central Ohio. The promotion surprised many people inside the company. Not because he lacked ability, because he had never asked for recognition. Carl Benson congratulated him personally. You've been ready for years. Jason smiled. I guess someone finally noticed. Carl laughed. They noticed long before you did. Outside the office, life continued quietly. Jason restored his father's old farmhouse on weekends. Not because it needed to become valuable, because it already was. The porch was repaired, the roof replaced, the old oak tree trimmed. Every improvement reminded him of evenings spent beside his father, learning that good work usually happened where no one applauded. One snowy afternoon, Margaret stopped by unexpectedly. She carried no legal folders, only a small wrapped package. I thought you'd want this. Jason opened it carefully. Inside rested the original handwritten letter from Daniel Ramirez. The court had finished with it. It finally belonged back with the family. Margaret looked around the restored farmhouse. He'd be proud. Jason smiled. I hope so. I know so. Before leaving, she paused at the front door. You know something. What? You never actually proved everyone wrong. Jason looked puzzled. I didn't. No. She smiled warmly. You simply gave them enough time to discover they were wrong on their own. After she drove away, Jason walked onto the porch. Snow drifted quietly across the empty fields. He opened his father's letter once more. The paper had grown softer from being unfolded so many times. One sentence caught his attention again. Do not seek revenge. Seek clarity. Justice belongs to evidence, not emotion. Jason folded the letter carefully and returned it to the pocket watch box. He no longer needed the words as instructions. They had become part of the way he lived. People in Columbus eventually forgot the conference speeches. They forgot the magazine interviews. They forgot the rumors that Jason Ramirez had been a man with nothing. But they remembered something else. The engineer who never argued with gossip. The son who honored his father's quiet principles. The man who allowed truth to arrive without chasing applause. Years later, a young engineer asked Jason why he never talked about his personal success. Jason looked toward the bridge they had just completed. Steel stretched across the river beneath a bright Ohio sky. He smiled. If the bridge is strong, people won't remember the speech. They'll remember that it carried them safely home. The young engineer nodded thoughtfully. Jason looked once more at the horizon. His father had been right from the very beginning. Real wealth was never measured by the stories people told. It was measured by the character that remained after every false story finally disappeared. Every story eventually asks the same quiet question, what remains? When the rumors fade away, Jason's journey reminds us that character is revealed not during moments of comfort, but during seasons of misunderstanding. He never won by shouting louder than those who judged him. He won because he refused to let anger replace wisdom, and because he trusted that truth, when supported by patience and evidence, would eventually speak for itself. Real strength is not found in proving everyone wrong overnight. It is found in staying true to your values long enough for the truth to become impossible to ignore. In our own lives, we may never face the exact circumstances Jason did, but many of us know what it feels like to be underestimated, misjudged, or misunderstood. When that happens, remember that your integrity is an investment whose value grows over time. People may question your appearance, your career, your finances, or your choices, but they can never take away the quiet confidence that comes from living honestly. Success built on image may impress people for a moment, but a life built on character earns respect that lasts for years. Now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been judged unfairly or underestimated by someone who didn't know your true story? How did you respond, and what lesson did that experience teach you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story may encourage someone else who needs to read it today. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and join us for tomorrow's story, where another ordinary person will discover that quiet courage and unwavering integrity can change a life in ways no one expects.